We are honored to have the U.S. Senator Tim Kaine here with us, and there's no way I can do justice to this gentleman who's done so much for the Commonwealth of Virginia, but in particular this region, than to have him introduced by ODU President John Broderick, the past president. So I want to say a few words about John before I bring him up. In 2012, Oceans was about harnessing the power of the ocean. And 10 months prior to October of 2012, I had the pleasure of meeting John Broderick, but it was through Larry Atkinson, who we're going to honor this week. And John was able to help 2012 start the conversation of Brazilian coast because, as I say, we talked a little bit about it, but it wasn't really a public conversation until the following week when Hurricane Sandy struck the coast, and then all of a sudden, we all talked about it. So John is the eighth president, was the eighth president of Old Dominion University. He was the longest serving president in the history of the school from 2008 to 2021, this year ago this past summer. So you can imagine when he showed for 2012, he was just sort of getting rolling, I suppose. But the one point about ODU campus is it's on Hampton Boulevard, and it's the main battery from campus, 20 minutes away, is the largest Navy base in the world. This road is extremely important for commerce. It's important for the military readiness and training. How we man, train, and equip ships on the naval base is now under duress from routine tidal flooding. So just to say that under John's leadership, I was able to directly observe what he was able to do to transform a campus into a multidisciplinary approach for degrees that would tackle societal issues. And resilient coasts became a priority for him. I know he worked closely with the senator to make Hampton Roads a more resilient community. There's more work to be done, but these two gentlemen, you can see we're going to honor their contributions to this throughout Oceans 22. So John, it's an honor to welcome you. Come on up. Thank you.
Because that's past tense, and that's exactly the way I like it. So thank you. Before I introduce the senator, I want to express my thanks to Ray and Laura and Dan and the local organizing committee, as well as our numerous sponsors and attendees for making this 2022 Oceans Conference and Exposition a reality. As Ray mentioned, back in 2012, when our first conference was held right here in Virginia Beach, none of us ever believed we would be morphing into what we have with this week's gathering, a 4-day event with 80 technical sessions, 415 presentations, and more than a dozen special panels. We have a remarkable all-star lineup of experts making themselves available to be here with us all this week. So I would ask all of you for just a moment to join me in a round of applause for that committee and all the people who put this great event together for us. Thank you. So now to Senator Kaine. The senator is no stranger in any part of Virginia after nearly 30 years of elected service to Virginians. He began his career as a city councilor in Richmond and then later became the city's mayor. He then went on to be the lieutenant governor of the Commonwealth and eventually the 70th governor of Virginia in 2006. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2012 and serves on the Armed Services, Budget, Foreign Relations, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pension committees. I will specifically mention his impact to higher education in our region because he was instrumental in helping Old Dominion, EVMS, and Norfolk State receive well-deserved funding and much-needed capital improvements during the time he was governor to ensure a high-quality education and world-class facilities were available to our students. As a person, you should know he served as a director of a technical school in the Honduras founded by Jesuit missionaries upon graduating from the University of Missouri, and that he and his wife, Ann Holton, are the parents of 3 grown children, one of whom is a Marine. You should also know that his wife, Ann, served as the Secretary of Education and later the interim president of George Mason. So Tim, please tell Ann I gave her a plug here this morning as well. One final mention of the senator. When you retire, as I did on June 30th, 2021, you wake up on July 1st and you wonder, okay, now what? Well, before I had a cup of coffee that morning, I had a call from Senator Kaine wishing me well and encouraging me to find happiness in my next chapter. I think another example of the kind of person our U.S. Senator Tim Kaine is. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you our Senator Tim Kaine.
So exciting to be here at the Oceans Conference, and I'll begin with just thanking my friend John for his kind words, but even more importantly, acknowledging his strong leadership. John became president at Old Dominion University right about the same time as Congress contemplated its first climate change-related bill, which was a bill that was introduced, a bipartisan bill that John Warner and Joe Lieberman introduced. And I watched as governor and then senator as John's leadership with Ray and others really built out ODU as a hub for climate resilience, particularly with respect to sea level rise, but really more broadly, trying to get our federal agencies, our state and local government, our research institutions, ODU, VIMS, Norfolk State, others, aligned around what do we do in Hampton Roads and what do we do more generally to tackle this really existential challenge for the planet. And John, your leadership at ODU during those years really cemented ODU's role as a hub in this region and nationally on climate and ocean matters. Often I would go to campus for events. We had a huge roundtable with bipartisan congressional representation and key state agency heads at 2015 at ODU that, we thought, Diane Kaufman from my office, we talked about this. We thought we'd get good attendance, but we didn't realize we would pack the biggest ballroom there is at the Convocation Center at ODU. And it's a tribute to the fact that Hampton Roads as a community is really, really grappling with this issue. I represent Virginia with 8.5 million people, 134 cities and counties. Wherever I go in Virginia, I'm always reminding people, for us, climate change, climate issues are not a tomorrow issue, they're a today issue. And I talk about sea level rise in Hampton Roads, and I talk about extreme flooding in Appalachia. Virginians are seeing this every day. So I'm really happy that the Oceans Conference is back here in Hampton Roads, back after 2010, and back at a critical time. The last time you were here, it was immediately thereafter, Superstorm Sandy, which did so much damage. We are still spending money in the Hampton Roads area that was part of the Superstorm Sandy relief package, monies that were not spent quickly, but that local communities sort of really, really plan to spend them wisely rather than quickly. And I've had an opportunity to visit some of the investments that are being made. And so here we're gathering at an Oceans Conference after big hurricanes, Hurricane Ian hitting Florida and other states, and Hurricane Fiona devastating southern Puerto Rico. So I don't think it's possible to have an Oceans Conference now anywhere where there isn't some instantaneous evidence of the need for all of the stakeholders, U.S. and international stakeholders and academics and researchers and elected officials to gather and grapple with what are the right policies for the future health of our oceans and our communities. I'm going to talk a little bit about this moment in time in Congress. It's a good moment in time in Congress because we're finally investing money in this. You know, you can count on Congress in the aftermath of storms to come in and do storm relief packages. And indeed, the budget that we just passed a couple weeks ago, a continuing resolution that will take us to a full budget by year, and included some emergency relief funds for Puerto Rico, for Florida, for communities like the Appalachian communities that got hit. So yes, after the fact, we will respond to emergencies and come up with an emergency relief package, but in two particular bills, the Infrastructure Act that we passed in a bipartisan way almost a year ago, and the Inflation Reduction Act that we passed in September, you are seeing finally a Congress that is willing to proactively try to make investments in some of the priorities that you're grappling with here with respect to oceans resilience. And I'm going to spend some time talking about that, but that's just one of my two punchline pieces, that we're finally making investments, and so it's a good time for the experts to be around the table to decide the best way to do them. The second punchline, and I want to start with this one, is we should do this with a sense of optimism that we could make a difference, not a sense of maybe we're starting too late, maybe we're not doing enough. Let's do it with a sense of optimism. Today is the 50th anniversary of one of the best pieces of legislation that Congress ever passed, the Clean Water Act. And those of you who work in the ocean space, you care about water cleanliness, you care about the environment, so I suspect many of you know the story of the Clean Water Act, but for those of you that don't, let me just mention it. The state of America's waters, our domestic waters, was atrocious because we essentially were using our waterways as open sewers. Most communities did. My community, Richmond, used the James River as a sewer for, sewage treatment plants that weren't up to snuff, for agricultural runoff, for industrial effluent. There was a plant in Hopewell that Allied Signal ran that produced a chemical, ketone, that contaminated the river, so much so that Governor Mills Godwin had to declare the 100 miles of the James between Richmond and the Chesapeake Bay off limits to any fishing, and that ban lasted for 13 years. There were other high-profile instances around the country, the Cuyahoga River on fire as it was going into Lake Erie because of dumping of arsenic and other chemicals, and that was the way that we had treated our waterways. These were places to get rid of what we didn't want. Ed Muskie introduced the Clean Water Act in 1971, senator from Maine. It passed the Senate 5 days after he introduced the bill, that will never happen again, I assure you. If I introduced something saying Mother's Day was a good idea, it would take 6 months, and I might be lucky to get it passed. It languished a little bit on the House, but eventually passed the House in, I think, the summer of 1972, in a slightly different version. The two houses had to conference it. They put it together into the Clean Water Act that we now know. They put it on President Nixon's desk in October of 1972, and he vetoed it. Now, it was interesting. President Nixon was a pretty good environmental president. He created the EPA, and there were other significant environmental accomplishments of the Nixon administration, but he vetoed the Clean Water Act. But even in a very divided Congress, and even in a Congress right before the 1972 presidential election, bipartisan senators and House members came together to override Nixon's veto, and that's how the Clean Water Act started. The Clean Water Act for Richmond has been an absolute godsend, and it taught me a very valuable lesson. I was the mayor of Richmond on city council from 1994 through 2001, the mayor from 98 to 01 until I was elected lieutenant governor, and we were in the very throes of trying to reclaim our river, to clean it up for tourism, for fishing, for whitewater kayaking, to bring back the bald eagles, which had been the most plentiful in the United States, had been in the Chesapeake region and in the Alaska region at the time Europeans first came here, but bald eagles had been wiped out in the James and much of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Sturgeon had been wiped out. Well, little and by little, the Clean Water Act over time has caused Richmond to reorient around the river and turn it from our sewer to our front porch. Sturgeon are back. They were thought to be extinct. I have a James River guide from 1997 that said sturgeon are extinct in the James River. I see sturgeon every spawning season from my canoe. They're back strong. Bald eagles are back. Hundreds of nesting pairs of bald eagles. I have one 400 yards from my window that I can see every day. And it's because of the Clean Water Act. And different cities can come and give the same story. I mention this because obviously the Clean Water Act affects oceans. What does the Bible say? All the rivers run into the sea, and yet the sea is not filled. Even when that was written in the Old Testament, 500 years BC, the people realized, rivers run continuously into the sea, but the sea never fills up. They understood the cycle of a beginnings of a stream and a river running into the sea, and then evaporation and into the clouds, and then rain back at the source of the stream. They understood the water cycle. And obviously the Clean Water Act has made the Chesapeake Bay cleaner than it would have been, and has made the eastern seaboard off Virginia cleaner than it would have been. So there's a connection there, but I really bring up the Clean Water Act story just to tell you that the success of the Clean Water Act over the last 50 years should make us feel optimistic about the fate of our oceans and the fate of our climate, because we've demonstrated that we can do a regulatory and investment suite of solutions and then calibrate it and improve it over time and get it right. The Clean Water Act isn't perfect. There's a huge case in the Supreme Court right now over what is a water of the United States. The idea behind the Clean Water Act, it was to regulate waters that have some interstate character. And so how small does the stream or marsh have to be before it's, well, that's not really an interstate waterway, it only affects a local jurisdiction. And this has been a controversial issue from the beginning. And there's other issues in the Clean Water Act that are controversial too. But 50 years of it shows that wise policy, wise regulation, wise investment, and the Clean Water Act in particular, federal standards with some state flexibility and local implementation. So each level of government with the Clean Water Act had a responsibility placed on its shoulders. And I think you're going to see the same thing in some of the smart solutions with respect to our oceans. It's going to be federal investment and federal policy, significant role for state governments, but where the rubber really meets the road, John, is in what you're doing in Hampton Roads. The stakeholders around the table, from local government, from business, tourism, the federal agencies that are co-sponsoring this, trying to come up with the right solutions. And in particular, the theme of your conference is about resilient solutions. The right solution for Norfolk is going to be different than for New Orleans. It's going to be different than for other communities, even within Virginia. Hampton Roads is threatened, so's Tangier. We have this beautiful island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay that could be wiped away by sea level rise. We have been able to obtain funding to help them with solutions. And even Jamestown Island, where the Virginia experiment of European settlement began, the National Trust for Historic Places placed Jamestown Island on its 11 most endangered sites just about 2 months ago. So we need your expertise, we need your solutions, but the main message that I want to give you is we're finally investing in solutions at the federal level, which really will put challenges on you to make sure we invest in the right way. And we should approach these investments with a sense of optimism, not like, woe is us, because the example of the Clean Water Act shows that we can get it right and make our water suitable for the next generations. The main theme of Oceans 2022 is resilient coasts, advancing today. Well, I guess I better put my reading glasses on. I used to be able to do this without reading glasses. Adapting today to secure tomorrow. And I have looked at the 3-day session, and I know you're covering so many different sub-themes with respect to research, public-private partnerships. I know you're going to honor Larry Atkinson today, Dr. Larry Atkinson, professor at ODU, who pioneered coastal resilience and integrated ocean observing systems and gained international renown and influence in doing so. And I understand that today you will honor a student with the first Larry Atkinson Endowment Scholarship, which is very important. It's already been mentioned that the last time you were here was in 2012, and as soon as you left, Superstorm Sandy hit the region. One of the challenges that I think we're going to have in Congress and that we need to grapple with is to the extent that there are still Superstorm Sandy funds, and now there's funds in the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, some funds from the most recent emergencies. We don't want to saddle the decision makers with 4 or 5 different sets of rules about how to use funds. I heard this loud and clear in Puerto Rico. I went down to do a hurricane tour about 10 days ago, and they said, look, we are still spending Hurricane Maria money, and now there's going to be Hurricane Ian money. Don't make us jump through 2 completely different sets of hoops to spend these dollars. Let us combine the dollars to attain the best solutions in the aftermath of these storms. And I think that that still is really important advice as we're grappling with these investments. When we had the conference, John, at ODU in 2015, it was clear that Hampton Roads was positioned to serve as a case study because the degree of coordination among the stakeholders, as I mentioned, put you ahead of some other communities. Even in Virginia, I'm dealing with metro areas in Virginia all the time, and not to say that Hampton Roads is always together on everything. It's so many different cities and counties, and you're on both sides of the water and with complicated crossings. But on this issue, you really, and your leadership and Ray's as well, has helped Hampton Roads achieve not just at the state level, but at a national level, a leadership position. And from that conference, interest in tackling sea level rise mitigation has become a higher and higher priority in my work. John mentioned the committees I'm on. I'm not on the most relevant committees you would think for some of these issues. I'm not on Environment and Public Works. I'm not on the committees that deal primarily with energy issues. But I'm on the Budget Committee. That matters. I'm on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. When we are grappling with these issues with allied nations all over the globe, looking at treaties like the Paris Climate Accord, looking at treaties like the Kigali Treaty that we just passed with respect to reduction of CFCs. There's no way, if we do everything perfectly in the United States, there's no way we can meet the need for an oceans mission without coordinating with our international partners, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is a good venue for that. I'm on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. We're dealing with the health outcomes driven by climate emergencies, including sea level rise and others, all the time. But probably the committee where I am most involved in resilience is the Armed Services Committee. And I got to praise our military leadership. And I know that Navy is one of the 3 federal agency co-sponsors. We have Navy, we have NOAA, and we have NASA. Navy, NOAA, NASA. Okay. Navy, NOAA, NASA. And I'm saying the Army Corps has got to fight their way in next year, right? Right? It's got to, not just 3, we got to get 4. But I am really proud of our military leadership. I am the chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. And what readiness means, all installations, all acquisitions. It also means what are the readiness metrics that can tell us whether we can fight a war and win it tomorrow. But really the work of readiness is all installations and all acquisitions. And so, of course, we are dealing with sea level rise and climate resilience issues all over the planet. It's not only sea level rise at the Norfolk Naval Base. I remember, John, when we had the conference at ODU, and we were talking about to what extent sea level rise and climate issues could be a factor in BRAC rounds if we ever think about closing or rationalizing bases. And then the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was over these installation and acquisition issues, said, we're definitely going to have to think about that. But it's bad news and good news. Virginia's bases affected by sea level rise aren't the only bases in the United States affected by climate. Try running a base in an area where there's been persistent drought. 100,000 people on or off the base every day, and you don't have a reliable water supply. So the issues on the Armed Services Committee have really focused us on resilience. And both the Pentagon, and I will say this has been fairly constant under both Democratic and Republican administrations during the time I've been in the Senate, the Pentagon, but particularly far-reaching, far-sighted installation commanders, and even our committee members. You will see in Pentagon budgets, we're working on the National Defense Authorization Act right now. We will likely do a conference and vote on it within the next month. You see increasing levels of investments around resilience issues, which is a positive sign. Senator Warner and I, along with other members of our delegation, have long championed the approval of Army Corps-led coastal storm risk management plans for the cities in the region. And I hope Part of the conference here is hearing a little bit about what's happening right in this region. As a case study, you come from all over the United States, and we have people here from around the world and viewing this from around the world. I hope you look at some of the work that's being done in Norfolk in particular and other communities in the region on these coastal storm risk management plans. Congress legislates how the Army Corps selects these projects through the Water Resources Development Act. We do it every 2 years, the WRDA, and then we do annual appropriations to fund these. When approved, these studies offer federal resources to combine with the local cost share to the design and construction of flood control infrastructure to save properties, save businesses, and people, most importantly, from the worst impacts of sea level rise. We had been doing good work on the planning side, but as often the case in Congress, we spent a lot of time on the diagnosis, but we're not necessarily paying for the prescription. And so, yes, on the plan, that's great. A study for Norfolk and the surrounding area was authorized in 2012 following Hurricane Sandy. And the Army Corps of Engineers signed the chief's report in February 2019 recommending that, okay, here's a study, let's get funding for it. The signing marked the end of the feasibility stage, but now will we act? After a few other milestones, we successfully included a construction authorization in the 2020 WRDA, and in 2022, thanks to the extra funding that we achieved in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and that funding is going to roll out over the course of about 8 years and has a lot of opportunities for us. But because of the report and the study, and then the funding in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we were able to get $400 million, which is a huge first tranche of construction money for the Norfolk project. The infrastructure bill also unlocked the beginning, a $1.5 million and a new start for a similar study for Virginia Beach. So Norfolk has moved out, done the study. We're now making the investments. I visited them not far from here in the Compostela neighborhood about 3 months ago and saw them underway. We're working on a similar measure for the city of Hampton. And we also, in the infrastructure bill, were able to get $225 million for deepening and widening the Norfolk Harbor. Certainly, as you're grappling with oceans, you're grappling not just with the cleanliness and the environmental impacts, but you're grappling with uses of oceans. And the uses are complex here. The naval operation, the commercial port, the second largest port on the east coast of the United States, an exciting new development, the development of offshore wind, 25 miles or 25 kilometers east of here, which is going to be a great opportunity for us to be a contributor to climate change solutions, but it also poses some significant oceans-related challenges. The Corps has to decide how far apart should the pylons be so that they can do rescue efforts for boats if they have challenges when they're out in that space. So there's a lot to do. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is in charge of doing the permitting for offshore wind. Well, I can tell you this, when we were doing no offshore wind, that permitting office at BOEM was pretty small. Suddenly we're going to rocket forward and try to do offshore wind in a major way. We can't do it off the permitting office of the BOEM status quo ante, so we've had to, and the Corps has really stepped up big to lend expertise to BOEM so we can expand offshore wind. When the infrastructure bill was being negotiated, Senator Warner and I knew that we had to make resilience, the theme of your Oceans 22, a top priority. And so we included in the bill $9.5 billion for the Army Corps infrastructure projects, like harbor dredging, coastal resiliency, and repairing damages to Corps projects that are caused by natural disasters, including sea level rise. The Corps is a great agency to work for, but like a lot of federal agencies, or frankly, a lot of my state agencies, like my Department of Transportation when I was governor, their to-do list is a lot longer than their bank account. And it can be frustrating when you're a local official and you really understand the critical need for a project to see your project sort of acknowledged as important, but the resources are not enough to get them done. And so then that always puts the Corps in the past in a tough scenario. Do we just do a little bit on a lot of projects and not get a big bang for the buck? Or do we invest heavily in a few projects and make them happen and then hope Congress will do the right thing? The infrastructure bill $9.5 billion in money in addition to what the Corps was normally receiving can really help us take some of these projects that have been on the to-do list, like the Hampton Roads projects, and advance them and accelerate them. This funding for the Norfolk Coastal Storm Resource Plan was a huge win for Virginia. The scope of the project is a comprehensive integration for flood risk management and solutions in the city. It has an equity component. Some of the neighborhoods that are going to be hit hardest by sea level rise are low-income neighborhoods or historic African-American neighborhoods with a lot of deep and important history. I sometimes have to battle with folks who, for example, Tangier Island. Well, there's only 500 people who live there. Why should we spend so much money? There's only 500 people who live there. You sometimes can hear the same thing about some minority or low-income communities. Hey, sea level rise is natural. You know, why should we be spending money to do it? We spend money to protect barrier islands for shorebirds, right? And I'm glad we do. But we should be spending money wisely, not in short-sighted ways, but in far-sighted ways to protect people in the communities that they've loved and the communities that have really meant something to the fabric of who Virginia is. So all in all, the Norfolk project is an enormous undertaking by the city and the Army Corps. I told you proudly we got $400+ million for it, but the total price tag that the Corps estimates together with the city is about $1.6 billion. Some of that will be local funding. Some of that will be state funding. The work that we did in the American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act that gave sizable resources to state and local governments. Because it was one-time money, most state and local governments really prioritized using those for capital projects rather than ongoing programs. And so a lot of the CARES and American Rescue Plan money in Virginia have gone into projects like this, or combined sewer overflow treatment in Richmond and Lynchburg. So we are advancing the ball on water cleanliness and resilience, not just in the infrastructure bill, but in wise use of the one-time monies that Congress granted our communities under the ARP and the CARES Act. I think this successful construction in Norfolk is going to be a critical example for cities around the country and around the world. And you know, and you've already heard how significant the challenge is in Norfolk. Ocean levels have risen globally about 8 to 9 inches since 1880, and NOAA has said that we can expect sea level to rise this amount again just by 2050. You know, just by 2050, so in essentially 25 years, we will see sea level rise that will match what it's matched in the last 200 years. That's the NOAA expectation. The Inflation Reduction Act that we did, I talked about the infrastructure bill and the investments that we can make there, and I'm very proud to say that was bipartisan, and it ought to be, because these dollars are welcomed. I do not know a mayor or governor of any party that says, I don't want infrastructure spending. It was bipartisan, and it should be. Now, I wish the Inflation Reduction Act had been bipartisan. It wasn't. It was one of the 3 things that during my 10 years in the Senate passed by 1 vote. I'm sure all of us in our lines of work, we sometimes ask ourselves, is it worth it? Why am I doing this? And there are certain, my daughter's an actress, and you know, she always says about a role, what's my motivation? Well, sometimes in the Senate, it's like, what's my motivation? 3 times I've been in the Senate when we did something by 1 vote. Save the Affordable Care Act. 30 million people didn't lose their health insurance. That was by 1 vote. Passed the American Rescue Plan to massively deploy vaccines all across the United States and support individuals. That was by 1 vote. And then the Inflation Reduction Act by 1 vote. On those days, I don't need to ask myself for my motivation, because I think, wow, if I had not been here, it might have gone the other direction. The Inflation Reduction Act really was sort of 2 pillars, funded by a 3rd pillar, tax reform, but the 2 pillars, first there was a health component, primarily Medicare, the Black Lung Benefit Program, some health programs. But the other pillar of the program was advancing on a clean energy economy and doing $360 billion of tax credits to advance clean energy so that we can tackle these challenges of climate change that are leading to sea level rise and other climate emergencies. $360 billion for clean energy is just by a factor of, 10 or 50 or 100 more than we've been willing or able to do in the past. And we already see, even in the couple of months since we passed the bill, major manufacturing in the clean energy space coming to the United States because they know now we can rely on you. The United States wants to be a leader again in this. And I am proud, and I suspect that you've heard a little bit about it. We're so proud to be on the front edge in Virginia of offshore wind. It's not you don't want to just be the community that says we're the second most vulnerable community to sea level rise. You also want to be in a community known for, and we're really being innovative in solutions to deal with climate. And offshore wind is going to be one of those solutions. We're on the front end of it with working pilot turbines off our coast, with a offshore wind farm being currently in the permitting process off our coast, with an offshore wind farm off the Outer Banks, which will use the Port of Virginia for critical goods and services, which will help the economy here. And as you might imagine, because the United States was doing no offshore wind, there was no offshore wind component manufacturing in the United States. Why would there be? Since we're now going full tilt toward offshore wind and promoting tax credits to advantage it, the first offshore wind component manufacturing in the United States is going to be done right here in Hampton Roads at Portsmouth. The Portsmouth terminal was one of the 4 terminals that were part of the Port of Virginia, but they've reconfigured which operations are at the 2 terminals in Norfolk, the Portsmouth terminal and the Newport News terminal, to create significant space on the Portsmouth site so that we can do offshore wind component manufacturing here that will not only serve the 2 farms that are near us, but that could be really a center of manufacturing excellence for the entire U.S. offshore wind, particularly for the Gulf and the East Coast. So we are not just a challenged community, we're a solutions community. If we hammer and do these investments in the Inflation Reduction Act the right way, the goal is to reduce our nation's carbon emissions by roughly 40% by 2030 in order to secure this better and healthier future for our kids and grandkids. By advancing, broadening our energy portfolio, advancing low and no carbon energy will bring costs down for people. You know, they tell you diversify your portfolio. We don't want to be at the mercy of dictatorships. We don't want our allies to be at the mercy of dictatorships. Watch what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now. So much of this is about a dying nation that is in decline, that wants to extend itself by using its energy resources to hold Ukraine and other nations hostage. There are more elements to it as well. Putin's belief that he wants to reassemble the original Mother Russia that he believes began in Ukraine in the 900s with the Christianization of Ukrainians, and his belief that his personal desire to do that trumps all principles of international law and sovereignty. But the only thing that's really funding this war machine effort is the natural gas and other energy resources that he has. And so to the extent that the U.S. can pioneer new energy technologies, whether it's offshore wind or whether it's more robust exports of LNG to these nations as a bridge fuel until they themselves have robust low and no carbon energy economies, this is not just environmental politics and manufacturing jobs and economic development, it's critical to national security for the United States and for our allies. In that, I have to acknowledge another thing that was done just recently that deals with ocean energy, and that is the Biden administration struck a really far-reaching, not that well commented upon because the world has too many crises right now, but the Biden administration struck a deal between Israel and Lebanon to do energy exploration and energy production in the Mediterranean off their coasts in an area where they would have a border that would extend out into the ocean. Lebanon and Israel doing a diplomatic deal together that could have significant benefits and enable them to be energy independent of others is a big deal on the energy front. It's also a very, very big deal with the Israel-Lebanon history, with the presence of Hezbollah so strong in southern Lebanon. The fact that we could do a deal like this shows that, hey, if we can be creative, and this is an international conference, if we can be creative across international boundaries to grapple with climate and ocean and energy questions, we not only do right by today, but we build trust that can be used as a step to the next efforts that we can undertake together. I'll conclude and just say that I'm really proud of what Virginia has done, particularly in the clean energy space and trying to be a leader. When I was governor, I realized the state didn't have an energy plan. We had no energy plan. Not even within state government. Everybody who ran, a state government office in Norfolk, they'd make their own decision about energy usage, and somebody running one in Richmond would, somebody running one in Big Stone Gap would. We had no plan about how the state would purchase and conserve energy. We were one of the worst states in the country in alternative energy. One of the largest generators of solar and wind in the world is a company called AES. They're headquartered in Arlington. When I was governor, they had energy production all over the world, wind, solar, water, geothermal. They had not one project in Virginia. They were headquartered in Virginia, but they had not one alternative energy project in Virginia because our regulatory environment was hostile. We advantaged production of traditional energy. We didn't advantage production of clean energy. We did not advantage investments in conservation. Why would a utility invest in conservation that would cause its consumers to use less and pay them less? They would only do it if you incentivize, and we weren't doing that. So Virginia was a laggard on this stuff. We did an energy plan. We did the first climate plan when I was governor with a whole series of recommendations. Some we were able to do. Some sat on the shelf for a while, and the plan's been dusted off and returned to over the years. But just, for example, in the area of solar energy, in the last 5 years, Virginia has gone from bottom 10 in the nation in solar energy deployment to top 10 in the nation in the last 5 years. And we're rocketing ahead. This was before the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. With this tax credits, we'll rocket ahead even more. And you combine what we're doing in solar with the wind farm and our leadership now in offshore wind, Virginia is going to be a state that's going to be on everybody's radar screen as a state that is not just trying to find resilient solutions, but also being part of the bigger solution of reduction of climate change and its risk on our communities and on the planet. And again, I've got to give credit to multiple administrations. Since I was governor, there have been Democratic administrations, there have been Republican administrations. We've had 2 Democrat houses, we had 2 Republican houses, we've had split houses. But there has been an increasing awareness that our natural bounty, that our coast is a bipartisan priority, and an increasing willingness of legislators to try to tackle this. We have some controversies going now. Our governor has recently announced that we're pulling out of the regional greenhouse gas initiative, which I think is a mistake. And thus far, Virginia has not been willing to participate in a Biden-led initiative to bring the offshore wind states on the East Coast together to look at what we can do together. Thus far, Virginia's the only holdout. We're actually doing the projects, but we're not participating in the Biden administration's initiative to bring states together. I hope we'll get over that, what I view a little bit of a kind of partisan squabble, and sit down at the table. Because frankly, any table we sit down at, John, I'm still, as an ex-mayor and ex-governor, I still have this pride thing. Anytime Virginia's at the table, the whole thing's going to go better. And anytime when we're not at the table, it's not going to go as well. So I like being at the table, especially being at the table in a leadership position. But again, I'll just finish with the 2 punchlines. We're making investments. The nice thing about the combination of the Inflation Reduction Act and then this 8-year infrastructure investment is it doesn't have to end at 8 years. My hope is we'd get to the end of this 8-year process, see that these investments have really made a difference, and decide why not re-up and do another 8? Why would we fall back to substandard levels of investments on priorities like this? The need is still going to be there. But that depends on using the dollars wisely. So punchline 1, Congress has put money on the table. It's up to you, the stakeholders, to help us make sure we spend it the right way. And if we do, investment dollars will be there into the future. And punchline 2, we can be optimistic about this because we tackled a problem with the nation's domestic waterways 50 years ago that seemed insoluble after generations of neglect. And we have made huge progress, and we can do it again. Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you.
This last speech, I can't thank you enough, Senator. We are due for a 5-minute break so we can start plenary session number 2. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so we'll try and get that set up here on stage. Thank you to all of our speakers this morning. You've given us a great head start on the week. Thank you.